Hi everyone, my name's TSW, and in this video I'm going to be going through everything you need to know regarding shadow resistance for Tier 6 Phase 3 of the Burning Crusade Classic. So which bosses do you need shadow resistance for? I'm going to cover 3 bosses in this video. That's going to be Mother Shahraz, the 7th boss in Black Temple, Azgalor, the 3rd boss in Mount Hyjal, and Kaz'rogal, the 4th boss in Mount Hyjal. And also when and why you might want to use shadow resistance, and also how much. So a quick TLDR if you don't want to continue watching the rest of the video. Simply, how much resistance do I suggest for each boss? If you do find this information useful, please thumbs up the video and leave a comment to show the YouTube algorithm that this is a useful video. So to start off with Mother Shahraz in Black Temple, this is arguably the most important fight to have good shadow resistance. You want 300 plus. A priest will always be able to buff you with 70 shadow resistance from their shadow protection buff. So if you want 300 shadow resistance, you only need to supply 230 yourself. The 70 will be made up by the priest buff. Casters should be able to remain hit capped, particularly with a shaman in their group. If you can't get hit cap, just get as much hit as you can from a DPS perspective, of course. You're always better off wanding or casting a rank 1 spell than being dead. So don't worry too much if your DPS and your stats go really bad. The important thing is survivability. If you're pugging or have a hard time with raids in general in your guild, you can just get resistance cap. This will make the fight marginally easier at the cost of a slower kill. Next up is Azgalor in Mount Hyjal. You don't strictly need any shadow res for this fight, you can still kill the boss, but you would always want the effectively free shadow buff from your priest, and it's not bad to wear a really strong shadow resistance piece, such as the medallion from the Black Temple achievement quest, just for more consistent DPS. Your DPS might be ever so slightly less, but it will be much more consistent, particularly if you're a buff or debuff support class, and you're relying on uptime of buffs or debuffs. Having a little bit extra shadow resistance goes a long way to support your raid. And finally, Kaz'rogal. This is the hardest to calculate and depends mostly on the DPS of your raid. I'll expand on this later in the video, but a rough area to aim for is between 150 and 250 shadow resistance for mana users for a safe kill. If you're not a mana user, you won't need any shadow resistance at all. If you don't have shadow resistance now, you can pause the video and head straight to the auction house and simply search for level 65 to 70 of shadow protection and buy any cheap items. Do not, however, buy any necks, as you will get the best in slot shadow resistance neck from the Black Temple achievement quest. Once Black Temple has been released and the Ashtongue Deathsworn rep has been farmed, you will have access to crafted epic shadow resist gear, which is far superior to greens. That concludes the TLDR. Now let's get stuck into some of the boss mechanics and explain how shadow resistance makes all the difference, starting with Mother Shahraz. So the main mechanic of Mother Shahraz, and the reason you want to wear shadow resistance gear on almost the entire raid, the only people that don't really need shadow resistance on Mother Shahraz is the main tank and the 2 off tanks. The tanks are there to obviously tank the boss, and the additional tanks are there to share the cleave. There's a cleave called Saber Lash, which prevents the other off tanks from being able to be hit by these extra shadow mechanics. If your tanks are dying from shadow mechanics, it's no fault of their own specifically, but if you want to reduce the shadow damage taken, they can wear some shadow resistance. If you're unlucky, this can definitely be a thing. Also, if you're wanting to ensure a one-shot, maybe for a speed kill or progression kill, and you want to get rid of any kind of variation and randomness of tanks dying, and you're confident that your tanks won't die because they have lots of armor and health, the next thing to check off to stop any kind of death is just give them a little bit of shadow resistance for that random factor. So the main mechanic for Mother Shahraz is Fatal Attraction. This will be something that people talk about a lot and is basically the mechanic which will cause deaths and lead to a wipe. So Fatal Attraction is a randomly timed mechanic. It can happen after 5 seconds of the last Fatal Attraction, or 10 seconds, or 15 seconds, or longer. It's really random and it's hard to play around it. So what it does is teleports 3 random players to the same location within the room. So fortunately your tanks are immune to this mechanic because they take a Saber Lash, and that gives them immunity to Fatal Attraction. Once 3 players are selected for the Fatal Attraction, they will be teleported away and immediately start dealing 3000 shadow damage to themselves and anyone within 15 yards. They will also have a beam linking them to other players with Fatal Attraction. You need to remove the beam to remove the Fatal Attraction and its associated AoE damage. Spreading 25 yards will break the beam and remove the Fatal Attraction debuff. Once removed, you can return to your assigned location and continue the fight as normal. The best way to spread out is to form an equilateral triangle as soon as possible, but this can be difficult if you're teleported near a wall or near the raid. If your raid is consistently struggling to spread quickly and to break the Fatal Attraction debuff by spreading, simply adding more Shadow Res will give you the buffer you need to take additional ticks of the AoE and give you the best chance of survival until you can reach that 25 yard and break the debuff. And when you do find yourself Fatal Attractioned into the raid, you're relying on the whole raid having sufficient shadow resistance to stay alive. Sometimes it's best, if you are spreading from the Fatal Attraction, to actually run through the raid, because this means that you can cancel the Fatal Attraction debuff as soon as possible, but the consequence is you're going to be taking AoE damage on the raid for a little while. This, in my experience, is one of the key moments where tanks can die. If the tanks notice there's a Fatal Attraction on the tanks themselves, be ready to use Nightmare Seed or Last Stand to survive. Additional cooldowns for the whole raid could be Major Shadow Protection Potion, Health Stones, Health Potions, and a Priest's Power Word Shield. So to make matters worse, there are other mechanics that Mother Shahraz does in the form of her beams,
which we called a laser.
So every 9 seconds, a beam will hit 10 random raid members, and each beam type is repeated 3 times. So these beams can happen at any point during the Fatal Attraction because the Fatal Attraction time is random. So the first of the 4 beams is Sinful Beam, which thankfully can be partially resisted. So this deals 7,000 to 8,000 shadow damage, and when you're running away from the 2 other players hit by Fatal Attraction and you're half HP, you do not want to be taking a Sinful Beam that's going to kill you. So hopefully you have enough shadow resistance to have resisted a lot of the damage from the Fatal Attraction, and then if you are the target of a Sinful Beam, you again are relying on that shadow resistance to resist a large amount of the Sinful Beam to survive. The next beam is Sinister Beam, which is a binary spell. You'll either resist it or you won't resist it. So this will knock you up in the air, dealing 2,000 shadow damage, and the full damage will deal about half of your HP. So if you ever get knocked in the air on Mother Shahraz, you need to make sure that you're above half HP. You need to instantly heal yourself with an instant spell. You need to use a health stone or a health potion, or have lightning reactions on your healers and maybe throw a holy shock in or something like that, or intercept the boss if you can. Something to avoid dying if you're half HP. The third beam is Vile Beam, which is a dot which can be partially resisted, dealing about 2,500 per tick over an 8-second duration. The fourth beam, and maybe the most annoying for the mana users, is Wicked Beam, which deals around 4,000 shadow damage plus a 1,000 mana burn. You want to have high shadow resistance, not only for every other mechanic that I've mentioned, but also you want to be having a binary resist on the mana burn. You do not want the first 3 beams to be repeated every 9 seconds, to be Wicked Beam, and to straight away get 3,000 of your mana burnt. So here we are in a spreadsheet I made. This will show you the differences between having capped 365 shadow res and someone with 244 shadow res. Now, I said earlier in the TLDR that I recommend about 300 shadow res, so this is about in the middle, And if you're still struggling with Mother Shahraz, definitely go to cap at 365. So here I've got 100 rolls, 1 to 100, and they're repeated again on the right hand side. Now the difference is when you have capped, you don't need to roll as high in order to have a big amount of the resistance absorbed as a percentage. So with a 365 capped character, I can roll less than half, so a 46 in this case, and I still get a maximum absorb of 75%. Whereas with the 244 resist character, I need more than a 46 roll to get that 75% resisted. So with a base damage of the Fatal Attraction tick of 3000, with cap I only take 750 damage, but with 244, the same roll, I'm taking half the damage at 1500. So you can see maybe more clearly in the colors. We're seeing a lot of reds here and not that many oranges, where it's full of oranges and reds on the right hand side to indicate if it's a 25% resist of the damage or a 50% resist of the damage. If we go down to the bottom of 100 rolls, we can see that my average absorb is a 69% on the left, and on the right it's 48, just below 50%. Now, Royal Giraffe is a great guy with some great resistance resources. I'll link in the description. And by his calculation, he's getting 69 with cap, which is very similar to what I got, and a 50.6 on the right, which is within margin of error, I'd say. So another example I'll show you quickly is, if that wasn't clear enough, we have an example from Muck. So the first Fatal Attraction that Muck takes in the Nihilum video is 3 maximum resist rolls in a row, which is fantastic to see. Obviously Muck has some good shadow res. He then not only does well to absorb this amount of damage, but he also gets somewhat unlucky in that there's a sinful beam attacking him during the Fatal Attraction. Now this is death for anybody who is not wearing a high amount of shadow res, okay? Because if you're taking a sinful beam at any time, it's not pleasant, but when you're taking the burst damage of a Fatal Attraction, it can be fatal. So again, he does well to have a max absorb roll on the sinful beam. He then takes 2 more ticks of the Fatal Attraction. One is a maximum resist roll, and the second is only 50%. But that's okay because he made up for it earlier in the fight with all of these good, juicy 75 resist rolls. So he then takes 1 more Fatal Attraction tick. This is his final tick before the Fatal Attraction is removed, and then he can continue with the rest of the fight. So in total it was 1 second for the first tick of Fatal Attraction, 2 seconds for the second tick, and 3 seconds for the third. So this all happened in a 3-second time period, which leads to 7,249 damage or 2,416 damage per second. And I can calculate that this is roughly 316 shadow res based on the absorbs. So conversely, let's look what would happen if you only had 224 shadow resistance. So this is the example up here at the top. I took the first rolls from the top just to choose some data. And straight away we start off with, what would have been Muck's worst roll, a 50% absorb. So here we have a 50% absorb straight off the bat. And look, the second roll is only a 25% absorb. So straight away we're taking lots of damage, followed by another 50%. We have a sinful beam, the same as Muck, and we're only absorbing 50% instead of 75, and we continue to only take 50% absorbs. This is the same 3-second window, just with my random dice rolls from the top of the spreadsheet. This leads to a 13,000 shadow damage taken in 3 seconds, or 4,534 damage taken per second. So you can see quite clearly there is quite a difference in shadow damage taken between having 2/3 of shadow res and what Muck has approximately 316. Again, these are different rolls, so it will be different each time, but just to give some context of the real world advantages and disadvantages of having different amounts of shadow resistance. Another thing I must stress is how good Muck is at spreading with the Fatal Attraction and getting that crucial 25-yard distance from the other players. he's taking fewer ticks than many players will, simply because he's able to orient himself and run away from the other players. You cannot expect everyone in your raid, particularly if you're not playing at the high end, you can't expect everyone to be able to spread out as quickly as Muck, so you will be taking additional ticks from the Fatal Attraction, and that's when having capped shadow resistance becomes more attractive, because again, it gives you that buffer, that extra security to take less shadow damage to survive more consistently. And that about concludes it for Mother Shahraz. Moving on to the next boss, we have Azgalor, the third boss in Mount Hyjal. Now this is the boss where shadow resistance is the least impactful, and in fact you don't necessarily have to wear any shadow resistance for this fight, although as I said in the TLDR at the beginning of the video, some can still be helpful. In my calculations for the amount of shadow res and damage output, I just spammed Shadow Bolt on a BIS geared phase 2 Warlock and just studied the amount of DPS and how that changed relative to the amount of shadow res I was wearing. So here's my spreadsheet where I try to crunch the numbers as best I can. I'm not a mathematician or an Excel wizard, so bear with me. So the results for Azgalor essentially are: when you have no shadow res, I was doing 925 DPS. When I had a priest's shadow buff, I was doing 961 DPS. So nice, we can see that having shadow resistance actually increases my DPS. That's a good start. And then if I increase my shadow resistance further by wearing the neck from the attunement quest, I do 11 less DPS at 950. I would say that this is a worthwhile trade-off, particularly if you're replacing the resist neck for a neck which doesn't have hit, or yeah, just hit basically. I mean, when you are changing gear as a warlock, you want to be prioritizing items that have crit and spell damage on. You don't really want to be changing items that have hit on, because you're going to struggle to maintain hit cap. So in the phase 2 BIS list, or the BIS gear set I used, I was replacing things like my rings, my neck, my wrist. They were kind of like the key items that I want to whip out and replace for shadow res as soon as I can. Obviously, if you're not playing a warlock and maybe you're playing a healer or a different DPS, you will change the items which are least desirable to you when it comes to the stats that they have in favor of shadow res gear. The third and final boss I'm going to cover is Kaz'rogal. He's the fourth boss in Mount Hyjal and has the infamous debuff Mark of Kaz'rogal, which is a debuff on all mana users in the raid, which drains 600 mana over 5 seconds, so 3000 in total, and if this debuff reduces your mana to 0, you explode for 11,000 shadow damage to yourself and nearby allies. So you need to be away from the raid if you have 3000 mana or less, knowing that the next mark that hits you will kill you, and you don't want to bring other raid members down at the same time. This has initially a 45-second cooldown, but once cast, the cooldown is reduced by 5 seconds. So it starts at 45, and then 40, and then 35. It goes all the way down to a 10-second cooldown, at which point you've essentially met the soft enrage. So what you need to do is draw the fine line between having enough damage in order to kill the boss quickly and not have lots and lots of marks going out killing all of the mana users, and having enough shadow resistance that you can actually resist a few, 2 or 3 would be plenty, of the marks of Kaz'rogal in order to survive the fight long enough to actually have the damage to push him over. He has 4.2 million HP, and if we assume you have 16 DPSs, we can look at this spreadsheet and see kind of where we are in relation to the resistance that we might want. So looking over here, we have the quantity of marks going through, we have the seconds of the fight duration, we have the 1 to 100 rolls telling us, you know, what we're going to be resisting. And we have up here the resistance values: 70, 131, 227, and 279. We don't really need to worry too much about having over 300 resist here, but let's just have a look through. So if you only have the 70 resist from the priest buff, we have a 14% chance to have a resist on the mark. So with the rolls, we don't see anything 1 to 14, so we resist nothing. So we take a 3000 mana burn, followed by a 3000 mana burn, followed by a 3000 mana burn, at which point I assume that you're mana potioning and dark runing, and you're dying on the 4th mark. That's not good. But what does this tell us? With a 4,200,000 HP pool, in order to kill the boss at this stage, you would need your 16 DPSs to be having a 1,750 DPS mark to hit in order to kill this boss with literally no shadow res. So I don't think there are many raids out there that can achieve 1,750 DPS for their 16 DPSs on average. So we should probably get some shadow resistance, okay? So again, unfortunately, even with 131 shadow res with a 27% chance to resist, we don't roll low enough between 1 and 27 to get any resists on the second attempt here with more resist, and again, we still require the same DPS because we die at the same point. So upping our shadow res to 227 in this example gives us a 47% chance to resist. We get kind of unlucky and we only resist once, but that single resist lowers our DPS requirement by 250. So just one resist is effectively 250 DPS. So if you can, for example, use a Paladin bubble on the first, that's essentially giving you 250 DPS. Or if you can ice block, that's also extra DPS effectively because you can survive much longer into the fight. And now let's have a look at our 4th and highest example of 279 resistance, which gives us a 57% chance to resist. Now this one's a lot nicer, although obviously you're going to be dealing less damage because you have sacrificed your DPS gear or your healing gear for shadow resistance. So we have a lot more resists here, that's nice, and we end up dying to a 4th mark, and that achieves about 1,141 DPS. So as our odds to resist go up, the requirement for the DPS goes down because we're able to attack the boss for longer. And again, I've duplicated this 2 more times. So again here, we got lucky with the rolls, and we've got some nice low rolls. So even without any resistance, you know, if you get somewhat lucky, you can get by with only needing 1,300 DPS, but this is fairly lucky to roll below 14 twice. And again, when we have higher shadow resistance at 131, we're still getting somewhat lucky. So this comes down to how much damage can your raid achieve with various levels of shadow resistance. So what I would say is the best bet is to perhaps do something like Void Reaver or Tidewalker. I guess Tidewalker's not very good because you want to do some AoE there. You essentially want to have your raid, the raid that you expect to be killing Kaz'rogal, have your whole raid where, I don't know, 100, 200 shadow resistance, and see how much damage they can kick out for in a 3-minute window, 4-minute window, and see what DPS your average is. Because if for some really good reason you've got a really good raid and you somehow average 1,750 DPS for your 16 DPSs, you don't need any shadow resistance for Kaz'rogal. But let's say, for example, that your DPS is it's about 1,000. You're going to really want to be considering some hefty shadow res. The numbers up here are the ones that you want to be looking at. These are the averages over 3 passes. So I've passed this 3 times with random numbers for the shadow resistance, and this is what I found. So with 70 shadow resistance, you want to be somewhere in the realm of 1,600 DPS, okay, or higher. And if you have 131 shadow resistance, you want to be in the 1.5k DPS realm, okay? And then if you up it again to 227, about 1,300. But again, if you're in a raid where you're struggling for whatever reason to maintain 1,000 DPS, particularly because you're starting to have to wear shadow resistance gear, so your damage will be dropping. If you're hitting about 1,000 DPS, you could quite safely, by looking at this spreadsheet, say, okay, we'll try and hit around 279 shadow res, because if we can pump out with our 16 DPSs about 1,000 DPS, you should be able to kill the boss because the DPS requirement is only about 969. So use this information wisely, and again, it all comes down to how much damage your raid can pump out looking at your 16 DPSs. Okay, so all it is, quite simply, is 4,200,000 HP from the boss divided by your 16 DPSs. That means you need 22,821 raid DPS. Divide that by 16. Your 16 DPSs each need to do this amount of damage to kill the boss with these random rolls, surviving about this long 3 times repeated. So there's somewhat of an average between 3 passes. And these are the numbers that apparently this spreadsheet pops up that you need to be hitting for the various resistances. So I hope this video has been helpful. I wish you all the best of luck in Tier 6. If you have any questions going forward, because I am looking forward to making specific boss guides for each boss in Tier 6. So let me know if you have any questions or concerns, and I'll try and hit those points, or maybe do a quick Q&A at the end of the video for the future boss guides. I've been TSW. Please like, subscribe, share, post this on your Discord, whatever. And I hope to see you very soon. Take it easy.